I want to be the title sponsor. What's it going to cost?
I think around 10 million.
Yeah, that's a bit out of my budget.
I have the impression that we are in the place where we have to be now.
Greg had a really bad back all last week, so we caught up on your podcast with me giving him a back massage and him listening to you guys.
That's a wonderful image.
With exclusive interviews and the best analysis on two wheels, this is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast.
Hello, I'm Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birnie.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel Friebe.
Hello, guys.
Another remote one. Where are we all today? Well, we know where me and Lionel are. Where are you, Daniel?
I'm in Mallorca.
Nice, very nice. Riding your bike out there?
Yeah, kind of. Not wearing any lycra, but I am riding a bike.
Hipster cycling.
Yep.
Paul Smith would approve of that. He's not a big fan of lycra. I met Paul Smith last week for a Kilometre Zero upcoming. We've got lots to talk about. We've got part 2 of our Graham Bartlett interview. He's the chief executive at Velon. They are in partnership with the Tour de Suisse, which is ongoing at the moment. That will come up in the last part of today's podcast. We're going to talk about the Dauphiné. We're going to talk a little bit about the Tour de Suisse and lots else besides. But we should kick off, Lionel, with your news roundup, please.
Okay, Richard, a brief one this week. Chris Froome won the Dauphiné for the third time in his career, despite a spirited challenge from Romain Bardet on the stage to Meribel. That was the big stage on Saturday. The stage winners in the second half of the race were Edvald Boasson-Hagen of Dimension Data, Froome, Thibaut Pinot of Francis Desjeux, and another impressive victory for Steve Cummings of Dimension Data, a big attack on the last day. Romain Bardet finished 12 seconds behind Froome overall, which was a pretty impressive result, considering he lost 43 seconds when he crashed into his teammate Alexis Villamos towards the end of stage 2. Dan Martin of Ethics Quickstep edged out Richie Port of BMC for the third place on the podium. The Tour of Switzerland is underway, or the Tour de Suisse as we are required to call it, because that's what it's called. Fabian Cancellara won the opening time trial, and there have been a couple of stage wins for the world champion Peter Sagan so far. That race finishes at the weekend, and then it's headlong into the Tour de France with the national championships coming on the weekend between the end of the Tour de Suisse and the start of the Tour de France. Off the bike, a court in Spain has ruled that 211 blood bags that were seized in the Operacion Puerto investigation will not be destroyed, but will be made available to various sports bodies, including the World Anti-Doping Agency and the UCI. It's thought that as many as 23 cyclists may have stored blood for doping purposes. The doctor at the centre of the Madrid clinic that was raided 10 years ago now, that's Dr. Eufemiano Fuentes, has been cleared of charges relating to endangering public health. In a bit of transfer gossip, we might have a bit more of this later on in the episode, but one rumoured transfer in the off-season is that Orica Green Edge rider Michael Matthews might be joining Giant Alpecin next season. And meanwhile, another Australian rider, Cam Meyer, has decided to leave Dimension Data for personal reasons. He says he's been unable to train and race at the level required for the World Tour. Former German rider Rudi Altig passed away at the weekend, aged 79, after suffering with cancer. Altig was an accomplished track rider who turned his skills to the road later in his career. He was a national sprint champion in his early 20s, then moved on to endurance events, winning the World Individual Pursuit title in 1960 and 61. He turned to the road and was immediately successful, winning 3 stages and the overall in the 1962 Vuelta a España. That victory caused a bit of tension with his San Rafael teammate Jacques Anquetil, and things escalated at the Tour when Altig took the yellow jersey quite early in the race. Anquetil, who had his eyes on a third Tour victory, did not want his team wasting energy defending the lead for a rider he thought was too heavy to keep the jersey in the big mountains later in the race. As it was, Altig fell away from the top of the classification and Anquetil did win that third Tour. But later that year, Altig had his revenge in a way. At the Trofeo Baracchi, then a prestigious 2-up time trial held in Italy, Altig handed Anquetil a pasting, repeatedly dropping his teammate before slowing down, pushing him back up to speed and dropping him again. Altig also won the Tour of Flanders with a 60-kilometre solo break in 1964, and the following year in San Sebastian, Altig was the man who was beaten by Tom Simpson for the rainbow jersey in the World Championship road race. In 1966, Altig did win the world title at the Nürburgring in West Germany. Gianni Motta, an Italian who rode on the same Molteni team as Altig, was alleged to have helped him in the race, but that controversy soon died down when the first three refused to go for a dope test. They were initially disqualified, but later the result was allowed to stand. Altig's final classic win was the 1968 Milan-San Remo, and after retirement he worked as a director sportif and as German national team manager, and later as a TV commentator.
Et attention parce qu'au classement général,
il va aller faire la seconde, il va aller faire la troisième place pour les bonifications évidemment.
Ouais, mais Christopher Froome là, il est en train peut-être de gagner le Criterium du Dauphiné. Il a une 34 pour arriver et surtout il est en train de lâcher et Alberto Contador et Richie Porte. Julien Alaphilippe s'accroche. Voilà l'écart, 44 secondes, il va garder son maillot.
We're here at the Dauphiné. I said the race couldn't really get going until you arrived, and sure enough, you made the journey over the Alps on Friday, didn't you? You've been here since Friday.
Yes, exactly. Ciao, listeners. Only 3 days of the Dauphiné for me, but the most important thing is that Dauphiné is ending, and end of Dauphiné for me means start of my holidays, so hopefully.
Where are you going, Ciro?
Well, 1 week in Naples, 1 week in a little island, Italian island called San Domino, Tremiti Island, but the most important thing, not in Passo San Pellegrino with Vincenzo Nibali, not in Sestriere with Fabio Aru, not at all, no mountains.
We've had a lot of mountains in the last month, haven't we? Between the end of the Giro and this week at the Dauphiné, we've kind of overloaded on mountains.
You know, also in my worst nightmare, also yesterday night when I was alone in my bed, in my room of the hotel, I was thinking about mountains, and I mean, something is broken in my head, listeners, so I need really a period off in order to have a great Tour de France with you.
Well, I noticed you're wearing your Tour de France t-shirt, and yesterday you were wearing your No Giro t-shirt, but let's talk about the Tour de France, Ciro. This is the big preparation race for the Tour. Chris Froome looks as though he's going to win it. Alberto Contador not quite so strong in the mountains. Fabio Aru brilliant on one day, struggling the rest of the time in the high mountains. Ciro, what are your conclusions from this Dauphiné?
Well, the conclusion is that we have seen the usual Froome, and we have to remember that when Froome in 2013 and 2015 won the Dauphiné, later, 1 month later, won also the Tour de France. Contador is a strong, maybe not at the same level of Froome, but we have to consider that here there isn't Nairo Quintana. He will prepare in the Route du Sud next week, his last test from the Tour. So maybe Quintana in a certain way could be considered really the man of this year for the Tour de France, in my opinion. And concerning Fabio Aru, certainly good stage win for him, but he tested in the mountain stage in this Dauphiné, but maybe I have this impression, is not confirmed this, but maybe he would have expected a little bit better, to stay a little bit better than he is in this Dauphiné, but for sure he has the time to improve till the Tour. But in the Tour, you know that Astana there will be two leaders as Nibali and Aru together. It's not going to be easy for me.
Are they going to get on okay, Ciro? Are you going to have to be the peacemaker between Aru and Nibali at the Tour?
Not really, dear Daniel, dear listeners. I mean, it's something that, I'm not really interested to, but
all right.
No, not really, because as you can easily imagine, during the Tour, I will be thinking more about my holidays after the Tour in August, 3 weeks. But certainly Aru should be the leader of Astana, because Nibali, after the winning of the Giro, is preparing more. His big goal is the possible medal in the Olympics, the 6th of August. But as I told you, last year in Vuelta, we saw them together only for 1 stage and a half. Then we remember the expulsion from Vuelta of Nibali. So, the big question mark is how they can live together in the same team for 3 weeks. Not easy.
I think that's enough from us, Ciro, from the press room at Super Devoluy. Let's go to the finish and let's see you at the Tour de France. We'll hear a lot from you at the Tour, I think.
Let's hope so, listeners. See you soon.
So very nice to hear from Ciro Scognamiglio there from Gazzetta dello Sport, our old friend. Do you enjoy meeting up with him again at the Dauphiné, Daniel?
Always a pleasure, always a delight. He's in good form, wearing his No Ciro, No Giro t-shirt. He was actually wearing, the first day I saw him, he was wearing his Tour de France t-shirt. Always a sign that the start of the Grand Boucle is imminent. And yeah, on the second day he was wearing his No Ciro, No Giro t-shirt.
Well, you were there, Daniel, for the Dauphiné. We were watching it on television. It was an interesting race. As Lionel said in his news roundup, Bardet was impressive, although, you know, whether he would have got away with Pinot on the big stage to Meribel, because he was sort of out of it a little bit on GC, or appeared to be, didn't he, after his crash a few days earlier. So was his eventual second place, was that really an accurate reflection of his form?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at the way he climbed, particularly on the last day, and I think it was a good reflection. He just keeps improving, really. I mean, this year he spent quite a lot of time at Sierra Nevada, altitude before the Dauphiné, and you know, it's really like Pinot, is sort of up in the ante as far as technology, as far as training methodology, as far as kind of know-how is concerned every year, and the fruits are really coming to bear. And I think that he's going to be a real threat in Tour de France. Well, not really a threat perhaps for the first 2 or 3 positions, but I think he can genuinely harbour hopes of the top 5 place anyway.
Bradley Wiggins tipped him, didn't he, as the most likely Frenchman to win the Tour in the next few years. He's been the guy perhaps not in the headlines as much as Pinot and even Warren Barguil, but he seems to be a real student of the sport, doesn't he? He seems somebody who's certainly prepared to live the life and make the sacrifices required.
He is a real student of the sport. He's also a student of... Is it economics? Anyway, did you know that he's currently doing work experience, or a stage, what the French call a stage, as press officer for the Saint-Etienne rugby team?
Didn't know that.
He goes there. He goes into Saint-Etienne, who I think play in the top division in France. He goes there every couple of months, and he does a couple of sessions overseeing press conferences, fielding requests from journalists, and so on.
Something I can chat to him about, having been a press officer myself for the Borders rugby team about a decade or so ago, 15 years ago. Something we can chat about, perhaps. Hopefully he's enjoying it a bit more than I enjoyed it. But no, he was impressive. I think when we spoke last week, obviously GC was very much up in the air, and we were perhaps surprised by the way Chris Froome bounced back from his relatively disappointing prologue. I thought that was Contador. I thought we were going to see Contador back to his best, but Contador faded, didn't he?
Yeah, he did fade to a certain extent, although he was very honest and adamant all week about lacking speed in his legs in particular. It sounds as though he's sort of done 90% of the work that he needs to do before the Tour, but what's really missing is that sort of extra 10% to follow attacks in the mountains and to attack himself. That's certainly what he thinks, and he was quite relaxed, and he was incredibly relaxed all week, actually. He was in a very good mood. But on the other hand, his performances at the Dauphiné really were in line with what we've seen from him against the absolute top opposition in the last few years. I mean, you look back at his Tour de France record, and the last time he finished first in the Tour de France was 2010, and he was subsequently stripped of that victory. But in every tour since then, he's fallen slightly short, hasn't he? In the mountains, in particular. So and he's increasingly relied on these sort of surprise attacks, and I think this is something I've spoken about before. It's a pattern in the careers of the very best stage race, the very best Grand Tour racers. They tend to start their career capable of launching these long-range attacks and really winning à la pédale, beating everyone with sort of attacks on the final climbs of stages, and just showing themselves to be the strongest. And then what tends to happen as their careers progress is they start to rely more and more on their kind of savoir-faire. And this happened even with Eddie Merckx, as I've spoken about before. I think that he'd started doing things like attacking at the very top of climbs and putting pressure on people on descents, and attacking when his rivals didn't really expect it. And since 2012 Vuelta in particular is the sort of famous example of this with Contador when he attacked Perito Rodriguez at Fuente Day, that famous performance. And he's done a lot of that in recent years. And, he tried it at the Dauphiné to a certain extent on the penultimate day. Didn't work. But I think that if he's going to win the Tour de France, it's going to take something unexpected and remarkable, perhaps where Froome and Nairo Quintana aren't expecting it.
You could say that Bardet, that's where the danger could come from for Froome. Somebody like that who he let slip away. He obviously considered that Bardet wasn't too much of a danger overall, although it was pretty close in the end. But that could be the danger. I mean, I think what was most striking about the Dauphiné, not surprising, but most striking was the strength of Team Sky, and arguably that wasn't even them at full strength. I think Mikel Landa has got more to come. That was his first race since pulling out the Giro with illness, and he looked good, but not as good as he can look. Mikhail Kwiatkowski was ill, obviously, and it's a pretty scary, pretty daunting prospect for Froome's rivals at the Tour that team is going to be incredibly strong.
We shouldn't underestimate either that AG2R had to ride with strength in numbers to give Bardet any kind of chance of gaining the time back that he was trying to gain back. I mean, I think it was Jan Bakelants, Ben Gastauer and Mikel Schirel, was it? I think the three. It wasn't Villermoz, was it, up there? But I think they certainly had three riders up the road who then did an awful lot of work to drag Bardet into a strong position. And then it was Bardet and Pinot together, and although Pinot wasn't riding as hard perhaps to gain the time, because he was out of the overall picture, he was a very helpful ally. And it's always tempting to look at a stage like that and think, oh, maybe somebody could pull that off in the Tour de France. But the third week of the Tour de France, when this kind of move would have to be made, it's a very different task to try and do that deep into a 3-week race, when perhaps your sort of domestique riders aren't going to be capable of getting up the road and setting as fierce a pace. It's a little bit easier to try and pull something off like that on what was quite a short stage at the end of a week-long stage race. Nevertheless, exciting to watch, and it showed a sense of imagination and a sense of unity behind Bardet and belief in him that they would all give it everything they had to try and to gain the time. And they did have Sky on the ropes, and it was sort of 4 against 4. They made Sky work incredibly hard to bring that gap back down.
Yeah, it was as you say, Daniel, Sky did look at the limit. I mean, Froome's strongest teammate looked to be Sergio Henao, but someone like Wout Poels and certainly Landa, I think, will have more at the Tour. I think they'll be better there. Well, before we leave the Dauphiné, we should also mention Dan Martin, third overall, a bit of a breakthrough performance for him as a general classification rider, perhaps, and Julien Alaphilippe, another young Frenchman who performed extremely well, and also for him a breakthrough performance as a GC rider, both Ethics Quick-Step riders, of course.
Yeah, Dan Martin seems to be really happy there at Ethics Quick-Step. He's obviously moved this year, and just speaking to him regularly throughout the week, and he was very chipper, very relaxed. He's very pleased with the progress he's made since he's moved to Andorra. A lot of riders living in Andorra now. A few Spanish riders, Argentine rider Eduardo Sepulveda living there, Svein Tuft, quite a number of them. Obviously there are tax advantages, but also a lot of places to ride uphill, as you would expect. It's very mountainous. And Dan Martin he's also talked about the advantages of living at altitude. I think he's living at about 1,400 meters now, which various studies have indicated might be just about the ideal altitude to live at. You can obviously, there are Colombians that live higher than that, but 1,500 meters is supposedly very conducive to good training, good living. And Dan has talked about the advantages of that, and also just the advantages of climbing a lot in training, and a lot more than he did before when he was living in Girona. So his intention is to ride for GC at the Tour de France. He's ridden well as far as the GC is concerned on the Tour before, only to fall ill towards the end of the race. I think a couple of years ago he was riding well and fell ill towards the end, and that sort of compromised his GC ambitions. But, perhaps an outside bet for a podium, but could sneak into the top 5, certainly sneak into the top 10. And, and definitely, with the sort of speed he has at the end of mountain stages and the end of hilly stages, you could definitely see him winning a stage, couldn't you?
Eurosport, the home of cycling.
Thank you very much to Eurosport for their continuing sponsorship of the Cycling Podcast. They are showing Tour de Suisse at the moment, highlights in the evening, and Stage 8, that's Sunday's final stage, live on Eurosport 1. All stages live on the Eurosport player. The Route du Sud begins Thursday, the 16th of June, and highlights are on every evening. Also, the Route du Sud is live on the Eurosport player. That will be interesting for the return to racing of Nairo Quintana, tuning up for the Tour de France. He's been not racing too much recently, I think back home in Colombia training, but it'll be interesting to see how his form is just before the Tour. Now, we mentioned in the last part the Dauphiné. I think there's still a little bit of unfinished business from the Dauphiné because there were a lot of talking points. A really thrilling young riders competition. Julien Alaphilippe, who I mentioned earlier, ended up winning that just ahead of Adam Yates, but Louis Meintjes was also in the top 10 overall. It was a very close top 10 overall in general. Only about 2 minutes, I think, between all riders in top 10, or just over 2 minutes. But Alaphilippe, Daniel, he, I mentioned that this is a breakthrough sort of GC performance for him. He's obviously ridden very well in the Ardennes Classics. What does he look like as a stage race rider? Well, his recovery is obviously okay, can climb very well. Is that perhaps where his future lies? I don't know.
It's a good question, Rich. I mean, he certainly suggested that he has a future in big stage races this week. I mean, again, just speaking to him throughout the week, and he was coming into the mix zone every day because he had the white jersey, and he was very sort of circumspect about his chances of contending in the big mountain stages at the weekend, but he did end up riding with the best climbers for the majority of those stages. And he's punchy, he's quick, but seems to be able to go pretty well on the long climbs. I mean, the one reservation I would say about classing him too quickly among the sort of budding Grand Tour riders is that obviously the Dauphiné is only a week long, but the stages were also very short in the Dauphiné, which meant they were ridden aggressively, but the mountain stages at the weekend were quite a particular type of mountain stage, an awful lot of climbing but packed into a very short space, which obviously made them very aggressive. But it remains to be seen whether the sort of attrition of the second, third week in a Grand Tour might start to take their toll on Alaphilippe. But he's another one, a bit like the Yates twins, and certainly Adam Yates, who over the next couple of years are probably, well, maybe not have to make a decision. Maybe the decision will be made for them, but we'll find out whether they do have the sort of endurance to focus on 3-week stage races, or whether they're ultimately just going to be very, very successful riders in hilly classics and 1-week stage races. Yates and Alaphilippe certainly look quite similar in terms of their capabilities at the moment. Alaphilippe's probably slightly faster. Yates is probably slightly better climber, but certainly very talented guys.
The advantage that Alaphilippe has over other young riders that we've seen emerge and have a very good sort of Tour de France and then get funneled into more of a team role. I'm thinking of somebody like Michał Kwiatkowski, who looked really, really good and now is part of that Sky train with Wout Poels and co. They're just going to be on team duties, whereas Alaphilippe is much more in the same bracket as Adam Yates, in that he will have a certain flexibility and will be able to ride for himself and see how far he can go, whilst also having the advantage of Dan Martin as an older, more experienced rider who, if everything went well and he got a bit of a following wind, you could see Dan Martin finishing, just outside the top 5, I would have thought.
You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Birnie and Daniel Friebe.
So should we turn our attention to the Tour de Suisse, chaps? It's obviously ongoing, and the GC battle has still to really form or take any kind of shape. First few stages, terrible weather, but Peter Sagan, irresistible in the rainbow jersey. I mean, Our colleague Andy Hood at Velo News wrote a semi-humorous piece, it was humorous, about the circumstances in which Peter Sagan could possibly win the Tour de France. It was pretty far-fetched, and it involved him not cutting his hair and losing a lot of weight. But we've joked before, haven't we, about cutting out the high mountains and a Tour de France with just sort of medium-sized climbs could be one that Sagan, who is arguably the best all-round rider in the world, might win.
Yeah, not going to happen, is it?
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But it would be an exciting old race, wouldn't it? I mean, he won a stage in Switzerland the other day that was pretty lumpy. He's certainly far more than just a big kind of rouleur sprinter type, isn't he?
Yeah, but it's not going to happen.
No enthusiasm for this whatsoever.
Well, I mean, I'd just say, I'm not keen on speculation about things that might happen, let alone speculation about things that won't happen. But Sagan, he's ridden, the way he won the Tour of California, I know, a completely different level of opposition, different types of climbs, but the way he pushed himself so hard to win that overall on a climb that you would have thought he'd have difficulty on. It's not inconceivable if a race like the Tour de Suisse, the year that Fabian Cancellara won it, I mean, it didn't go particularly high, particularly often. I think that would be the limit of his sort of stage racing potential for Sagan.
Or 1984 Giro, Francesco Moser won. I would say Sagan's a better climber than Moser. Andy Hood mentioned someone like Sean Kelly, Laurent Jalabert, who, went from being sprinter, all-rounder types to Grand Tour winners. But, yeah, it's not going to happen, clearly. But it does strike me sometimes as a little bit absurd that the best all-round rider in the world actually has no chance of winning the race that's supposed to, provide a sort of showcase for the best all-round talents over 3 weeks, which is a Grand Tour.
Yeah, it's not going to happen, though, is it?
No, it's not. Nobody's suggesting that it is, other than Andy Hood's imaginary world.
Hello, my name is Charlene Joyner and I ride for Team Ford EcoBoost. You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast in association with the Poppy Scotland Sportif. 3 rides over some of the most spectacular roads in Scotland on September the 25th. For more information, see poppyscotland.org.uk.
So that was Charlene Joyner, as she said, former Commonwealth Games medalist, introducing the Poppy Scotland Sportif on the 25th of September over beautiful East Lothian roads, quiet roads, hilly roads. Daniel's into his climbing. So I mentioned the 3 rides last week. There's the Mickle route, the Midland route, and the Muckle route. These are Scottish words. The Mickle route, over 77 kilometres, is over 2,000 feet of climbing. The 110 kilometre route is 4,000 feet of climbing, and the Muckle route, over 162 kilometres, is over 7,000 feet of climbing. That's 2,100 metres for Daniel's benefit and others' benefit. So do enter the Poppy Scotland Sportif if you fancy doing a really good ride on really great roads. Go to poppyscotland.org.uk, and we're promoting that Sportif throughout June. I should also mention a new podcast that we launched this week, the cycling podcast Femina, presented by myself and Orla Shinoui. The first one has just gone live, so you'll find that on the usual feed at thecyclingpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to the cycling podcast normally. You'll find that. It's our first one. It's a monthly show, and it was great fun. And the next one will be coming soon, looking back at the Women's Tour, which starts this week, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the final part of the podcast. We're also doing an event next week with Joe Dombrowski in London at Rafa Spitalfields. That's Thursday the 23rd of June. Don't think there's anything else important happening that day. So Joe Dombrowski is appearing in the East End of London. Now, I should introduce part 2 of our Graham Bartlett interview. The 3 of us will return in the final part of the podcast, but a bit ago, Daniel and I went to visit Graham Bartlett at the offices of Velon in London. Part 1 we heard last week, and here is part 2, Graham Bartlett. You mentioned ASO, and they are a huge, powerful stakeholder in the sport. To what extent are Velon not competitors, but how would you describe that relationship? Because the perception of a lot of people is that the teams want some of the Tour de France pie, because it's the the cash cow, if you like, in professional cycling. How open to that do you think ASO are, and how would you describe the relationship with them?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is we're not competitors to ASO. I mean, I don't really understand how anybody could set up the position like that. The teams, whether it's Velon or not, the teams are partners with ASO. They partner in all their races. What we're looking to do is if we can make a better partnership, and that's both better for ASO and for us. And it's not just ASO; it's every race organizer. ASO are a big organizer, and the Tour de France is an amazing event. But if you interview ASO, I'm sure they'll tell you they want to make that race better. They're investing quite heavily to make that race better. They did broke some new ground last year with telemetry, and they invested a lot in that. And good, fair play to them. And we worked on that deal with them. So we have the same interest of ASO. From a Velon perspective, we want to partner with them and other race organisers to make their race and other races better, more exciting, more interesting, and more attractive to the existing fan base and the new fan base. We're not a competitor of ASO at all. We're a partner, and we've partnered with them on many occasions.
As I understand it, Graham, you are trying to create packages and create a spectacle which you will ultimately be able to sell, for want of a better word, to race organisers, and in return receive some of the broadcast money, TV broadcast money. We've heard stories before, and we've seen figures, and we know figures, and they're very modest. Apart from the Tour de France, what TV networks pay for. I've heard examples of TV networks paying barely tens of thousands for big grand tours in certain cases. Realistically, are we talking about the teams one day being able to generate 5, 10, 15 million euros from selling, whatever it is they end up being able to create in terms of spectacle, in terms of what Velon is able to create, or is it tens of thousands?
Well, quantifying what you think the sport may be worth is not only difficult, but also you have to factor in what the sport is now and what the sport could be, and doing that has changed very radically in the last 5 years, and that's true for any sport. I was fortunate enough to listen to Adam Silver, who's the commissioner of the NBA, talk a couple of weeks ago, and he was very clear that the whole landscape of the way that sport will be consumed by people, and indeed how their rights will be sold, will completely change again in the next 5 years. So factoring that in to try to answer your question, first of all, it's very difficult because you're looking at what's going to happen to the overall global landscape, short form content, digital broadcast, and so on. The position's massively changing for every sport. Can cycling be more popular? Can it capitalise on that potential expansion? Yes, I believe it can. To what extent, and how big is the opportunity there? I think it's difficult to judge, but I think it's certainly sizable enough to make it worth going after. And even if it wasn't, why would you not try and say, we're going to make this thing bigger, and how can we do it? And are we trying to monetize that position? Of course we are. Velon is unashamedly a business in the same way that every race organizer is a business. And do we want to see if we can do better business against other sports who are also businesses? Yes, absolutely. But quantifying it, I've seen many different numbers and very many different studies, as you have as well, about what the global position of the sport is worth. But I would prefer to look at what the global position of the sport can be, as opposed to currently what it is now, and then seeing if you divide that up and take 1%, it's not worth doing. I'm a bit more optimistic than that.
I mean, you mentioned cycling is a team sport, and you work with the teams. You are the teams, but it's also an individual sport, and it has very marketable individuals. Peter Sagan, people like that, Tom Dumoulin, some young riders, Marcel Kittel. What can Velon do, and maybe in front too, to other sports over the past decade or so seem to have done a very good job. I'm thinking of tennis in particular, who seem to do a very good job of marketing their outstanding individuals. And there's a little bit of a contradiction there, maybe, because it is a team sport, and these guys are part of bigger teams. But what do you think? What are your impressions of what the sport could do to just to just promote and market these guys a little bit better?
Well, as you might expect, the first thing that I would say is let's show people more of how incredible they are as athletes. It's very difficult for somebody who can't perform at the level of these guys to appreciate just how much better they are. It's easier in other sports. If you take golf or tennis or cricket, you can look at that sport and you can benchmark yourself against them. Anybody who's ridden a bike up, Flanders around Belgium and ridden up some of those amazing cobbled, steep, incredible climbs, you think, I can't even walk up some of those, never mind ride up that. So you can get a flavour for it, but it's difficult to see when you watch the race. Whereas in other sports, you can really see it. So the performance telemetry, how amazing these guys are, that's something I think can help to showcase them as the heroes that they should rightly be valued for. So that's the first thing I would say that Velon will look at, and we are doing. That's what we want to go to. And you're absolutely right. Any sport, team sport or otherwise, wants heroes, wants stars. It helps people to understand it. It helps people to be excited about it. Everybody wants to follow somebody. We're all fans at the end of the day, aren't we? And we want to be a fan of someone, the team, the riders. So yeah, we need to help people to understand more about what they do. We had this experience when we started with the cameras. We know that the cameras on the bikes then were an imposition. Aerodynamic, weight, it's an imposition. And if you trained as hard as those guys do and every ounce counts, and you say, well, can I just add some ounces to it? Well, that's an imposition. But the riders very quickly saw there's a benefit here, there's a trade-off here, because it will show people just what goes on, and people don't know how close we have to ride, how much on the edge we are. And the interesting thing for me is when we really started to get very good footage and really see it, people who'd ridden at a very high level were looking at it thinking, oh my God, I didn't realise that the pros are just in a different space to me. I could never do that with the bike. I could never behave that way in the peloton. That's what it's like. And that for me was really exciting. And I think that's what we want to use, the telemetry and the footage, to really show people just how incredible these guys are.
You ran through the teams earlier who are part of Velon. There are some World Tour teams who aren't part of Velon. What's the reason for that? And is there, still perhaps opportunity to bring them on board?
I think why other teams aren't in Velon is obviously a question for them, not me. But we've talked to everybody at different times, different stages. I think the 11 teams in Velon now took a decision a long time ago that we go with the number we've got and we get on with it. Because if you try and wait for absolutely everybody to agree absolutely everything, then you can't move. So you've got to start. The door is open. We are very happy to welcome other people to come into Velon if they share our objectives and they share what our philosophy is. That door has always been open. It is now, and it continues to be. But at the same time, we'll crack on with what we've got to do. There's a lot to do without having to wait for anybody else to join up. We've done collaboration deals with other teams. We did a couple last year that were very successful. Continue to do those. So there's different options for people. I mean, ultimately, it's quite clear with the Infront decision to make that partnership that we've got a lot of very big things that we want to do. And clearly to be part of that, I mean, the technology position, for instance, we will offer that to every other team. We're quite open about that. This is a platform that will be made available, and devices and opportunities will be made available to every team. And that's just not World Tour teams, that's any team in the race. We want to make it available to everybody because the fans will want to see it on everybody's bikes. They won't want to see it just on Velon's bikes. They'll want key riders from every team to be, and we're fully on board with that. But clearly, to really be part of something and drive it forward and really benefit from what's going to happen, you need to be a full member of it. And we're open to people doing that.
Yeah. How might that work, Graham? If let's take a team at random, FDJ Française des Jeux, for a particular race, they decided that they wanted to use your telemetry device or the telemetry devices and the on-board camera devices that you've developed with people like Infront and GoPro. Would you charge them a fee? And we have to remember as well that the bikes and everything that goes on the bikes, that does belong to the teams. You established this last year when before the Tour de France, when there was a little bit of debate about whether you would be able to use the GoPro cameras for the Tour de France. So yeah, how would that work if a team that wasn't a member of Velon wanted to just piecemeal for a certain race, use some of your technology?
Well, I think the first thing to say on that is the model is definitely not to charge them for it, because we get short shrift, I think, there, and rightly so. If we fought very hard and to make sure that everybody understands that what is within the team is theirs, and that goes for France des Jeux in the same way it does for Katusha, Astana, Movistar, any other team, whether you're in Velon or not. Those are their rights, it's their position, absolutely. It's up to them. If they decide they want to use our system, great, that's fine. We'll figure something out with them. We certainly won't be charging them for the privilege. We'd work it out. But first of all, you must say that it's sacrosanct, it's their decision. It's not for Velon, and it's certainly not for Velon, and it's not for anybody else either to tell them that they must do that. It must be their choice and their decision. We did this last year with Movistar in the Giro, because we didn't have the camera deal with GoPro in the Giro. We used different cameras, but we had an obligation to RCS to deliver amazing footage of the Giro. And before the race, we spoke to our friends in Movistar. So look, come inside this. You should do it too. Do it with us, and we brought them in, and we shared with them our position on that, even though they weren't part of Velon. And it's the goal is to get a great, exciting race position out to the fans. You can do it by Velon doing something and other people joining in with that, or people joining Velon or not. It's not only us that can do that, it's everybody else can too, and we're very happy that other people come and do that as well. We'll do our thing, they can do their thing. Let's try and bring it together and get the best experience for the fans. That's what you've got to aim for. If you're not aiming at that, then you're in the wrong direction.
And Graham, is one of your planned innovations to create races and events which will give you carte blanche to do everything that you want to do with? So if you were to start, Velon was to organise its own race, there would be no obstacles to what you could do with the technology. There would be no obstacles to how you wanted to market it, and that is something one would imagine that you might have looked into.
We're not a race organiser, and I think we've got a lot of business that we need to do, and there's a lot of race organisers out there, and we're not one of them. So Velon is not a race organiser. I think that's I want to make that very clear. I think from our perspective, what we want to do is to see how we collaborate with the race organisers better. There's an awful lot of good races out there that we think we can partner with. That's our objective. That's our position. I mean, the UCI have made a reform where they've said very clearly that they want to expand what goes on in the World Tour, and they want to expand where those races are. So they've made an open invitation to a lot of other businesses out there to say, come on, step your race up into World Tour if you're slightly below it now, or indeed come along with a new race that can come into the World Tour. So I'm sure, I believe there's a lot of interest in that, and which is great. That's good for the sport. Anybody who comes in, we want to talk to, and wherever that comes from, we definitely want to talk to, because they say, look, this model works and it's going to become more prevalent. The team's working more closely with the organiser to make that race better. So whichever area the race comes from or wherever it stems out of, we'll look to partner and see what we can do with them.
So that was part 2 of our Graham Bartlett interview, the man in charge at Velon, and we had a very good response to last week's first part, didn't we? People, I think, were interested to hear what the guy in charge of Velon actually sounded like, and he's an interesting guy. He's got a very interesting history in sport, and he's been around a bit, and I think he's got an interesting perspective on cycling. What did you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I think it's just good to put a voice to the name. I mean, people have viewed Velon with suspicion and some degree of cynicism. I mean, I myself, and I think Lionel's the same, I often object to this assumption that more money will always make a sport better and healthier. I think there are a lot of case studies across sport and across the history of sport that show that's not necessarily the case. However, I can certainly see where Velon are coming from in terms of making sport more sustainable. I mean, even in the last few weeks, we've had news about I Am Cycling pulling out. It looks like they may now, well, there may be a future for that team. But talking to Oleg Tinkov at the weekend, and people sort of bridle when they hear Oleg Tinkov say that, it's my toy. It has been my toy, and now I'm going to put it away, referring to the fact that he's going to pull out from sponsorship at the end of the year, and people suggesting that he's putting 70 people out of work, but Oleg Tinkov has also given 70 people jobs over the past few years, and he may not like the way he's gone about things, and there was what seemed like a pretty unsavoury, if you'll excuse the pun, incident regarding the team chef only a couple of weeks ago, and he certainly seems to go about things the wrong way sometimes, but he has invested in the sport, and the sport has certainly needed people like him over the past few years. There are a lot of teams that have relied on sugar daddies, and probably half the world tour, if not more, has relied on sugar daddies to some extent, and I can certainly empathise with and endorse what Velon are trying to do in terms of changing that model slightly.
He rejected the idea that Velon were in any way sort of in opposition to ASO, but ASO are a big, not problem, but there's a big issue there, isn't there, in terms of what Velon are trying to do, which is leverage more money when the event that attracts by multiples of 10 the most sort of broadcast revenue, that's really what Velon want a piece of, isn't it?
Yeah, and you look at what ASO have done over the past couple of years, just quietly the way ASO are positioning themselves, and you think about the idea of a breakaway. There's obviously this dispute what seems like an ongoing dispute between the UCI and ASO, and you wonder what the implications would be if they did separate completely, and there was almost two different leagues of cycling, or two different governing bodies, one run by ASO and one run by Velon, or teams that were aligned with Velon. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be as clear cut as that. But you think about the calendar that ASO would have, and it's not just the Tour de France, but you think about the way they're building their calendar as well. The Tour of Germany is coming back next year. That's going to be quite a long, prestigious stage race run by ASO. This year, the Tour of California was really a fully fledged ASO race. You've got things like Yorkshire, you've got the Arctic race, and you've got, if you look at the calendar now, you've got an ASO, a good quality, strong ASO race in pretty much every month of the calendar, and every
corner of the globe.
Exactly, in every kind of race as well. You've got very prestigious historic classics. You've got new stage races in very sort of in very rich new territories. So it's interesting, and it's still quite difficult to see how Velon are going to
break that stranglehold.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Velon have got the partnership with Tour de Suisse, and that we've seen, obviously the bikes on the cameras on bikes, and they've been producing sort of daily highlights. I've noticed they've been splicing them with actual footage, of the race, the official, broadcast footage, so that you get more of a sense of what's actually happened in the race, as well as just the view from, on board, as it were. And I think there's still those sort of 3-minute packages can still seem a little bit underwhelming. Obviously luck plays a big part. Had the rider in front of Danny Van Poppel at the finish of yesterday's stage managed to capture his stunts on the final bend and his remarkable save from crashing when he hit the barriers, that would have, I'm sure, gone absolutely viral. But generally the viewing figures are pretty modest, and there is on-screen data as well. I noticed when Albacini was attacking the other day, there was speed, power, etc., and that can be quite interesting, but I would think only to quite a small number of people.
And Velon have just launched their new app, of course.
Lionel, you're always interested in this kind of stuff.
Well, I did say last week that that this on-bike footage is a bit underwhelming, and you're absolutely right, Richard. Until where does it really kind of go? Does it add to the storytelling of the race? I'm not sure it adds to the actual storytelling of the race. Does it give you a feeling of what it's like to be in the bunch? I'm not really sure it does, because there's no real sense of speed when obviously all the riders are going at the same speed as each other. They could be travelling at 25 kilometres an hour rather than 55 kilometres an hour, and the footage would probably look more or less the same. I've seen on-bike footage from amateur races that looks pretty much the same, and when you watch a race on TV, the impression is that the riders are really, really close together, and in a lot of this footage, that is dispelled as a little bit of a myth, because perhaps the footage is coming from further down the bunch, or it's it doesn't really convey what I think they hoped it would convey, which is that the peloton is a really kind of, it's a place where nerves are on edge and everybody's frayed and everybody's looking out for themselves before each other perhaps, and what have we really seen from that footage? Yeah, and until they put a camera on every bike, they can't hope for full coverage. But then that would be a mammoth editing job. I'm not sure really it's leading in the right direction. But
no, I can understand. I agree with Lionel to a certain extent, but this is a first step, isn't it? And as the technology gets better, I mean, I think I'm not entirely sure whether the technology has improved this year, but the image quality seems to be a bit better this year, and obviously the ultimate goal is to have live footage from a lot of bikes in the peloton, which presumably would add quite a lot, and we're accompanied with or by telemetry as well, which tells us where every rider is at any given moment in the bunch. And once all of these pieces of the jigsaw start to come together, then I think it can be used quite effectively.
I think it's a work in progress, and I mentioned Albacini, he was bridging up to a move, and you could imagine a scenario where time gaps are obviously helpful, but it's also very interesting to know, what kind of speed and the front group are going at and what power they're generating, as opposed to somebody bridging up to them, and you can perhaps see the race unfolding in a way through that data in a way that we don't at the moment. I can see how that might happen in the future. It is a work in progress.
Yeah, I'm not being needlessly doom and gloom about it. I'm just saying that at the moment it's not really where I think anyone would necessarily want it to be, and that there is a lot of potential, but there's quite a few steps on that road. I mean, I certainly agree that if you could tell where every rider is particularly in a mountain stage, and even when you click on the Tour de France's website and you look at it takes a long time for that data to get updated and to confirm who's in which group and what the time gaps are. I think that's fundamental to increasing our understanding of how the races are actually run, because very often when we interpret a race after it's finished, we could sort of work backwards from the result backwards, don't we? And we try and sort of construct a narrative based on how the race actually turned out, whereas if you've got that data in real time, you could see exactly what is happening, who is where, when somebody has made a move across, and when somebody got dropped. The more information that is there, the more there will be to interpret, and that will certainly add to our interest and understanding of
where someone got a sticky bottle. Anyway, there's lots more to talk about here, and we'll no doubt return to it. We've got a few other little things to wrap up this week, so we better crack on with them. I mentioned the women's tour earlier. I'm off to the women's tour tomorrow. Very much looking forward to that. We featured the Drops team in our first Cycling Podcast Femina. They are riding the women's tour. It'll be fascinating to see how they get on. We also featured the Bulls Dolmans team, who have been absolutely dominant this year. Lizzie Armitstead returning to racing now, not going to the women's tour thinking that she can win it, even if everybody else thinks that, but she does seem to be in good form, so it wouldn't be that much of a surprise. But Marianne Vos as well, a former winner, seems to be returning to her old level, so I think it's going to be probably the best women's tour yet, which is saying something, because it's been a cracking race the last couple of years. So I will go there, I'll report for that properly for the Cycling Podcast Femina, but also in brief next week. And you, Daniel, I think had there are a few stories sort of bubbling away at the moment, which we'll return to in future weeks, as the Bahrain cycling team project and the controversy around that. We'll certainly return to that properly perhaps next week. But there were a couple of stories over the weekend, weren't there, Daniel, which you were keen to address?
One in particular yesterday, Richard, the ruling that the Operacion Puerto blood bags, the much sort of debated, now notorious Operacion Puerto blood bags, would be handed over to the sporting authorities. So WADA, the UCI might even get some. And, you know, Operacion Puerto, of course, dates from 2006, the big scandal that broke on the eve of it was actually May 2006, wasn't it, that involving Eufemiano Fuentes, who was Jan Ulrich's gynecologist and coach, Dr. Ivan Basso, various other people who subsequently received bans. But there were a number of blood bags that were never paired with athletes, 211 of them being stored in Barcelona, and they are now going to be released. The judge, the presiding judge, had originally ruled that these bags were not going to be released. Now they are going to be released, but it's 10 years since Operacion Puerto. It's also, it's just beyond the dates when the statute of limitations on, certainly as far as the sporting authorities are concerned, has run out. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and there are all sorts of loopholes that WADA and the UCI might now look to exploit. You know, there's talk of force majeure, external circumstances having prevented them from analysing these blood bags earlier, and therefore the statute of limitations not applying. But Tuesday there was some degree of almost celebration at the fact that the truth was finally going to come out. I'm quite doubtful of that for a number of reasons. One is the statute of limitations. There seems to be this assumption, this idea that it's very easy to pair the bags with athletes and very easy to get people's DNA samples. You know, not least I think there's a perception that because the UCI and other sporting authorities test or do blood tests regularly, they have this huge DNA database that they can just simply match the bags with. That's not the case. I mean, you look back at the Alejandro Valverde case when he actually did get prosecuted. I mean, it took them really 4 years initially it took them 2 years to get a sample that they could use for DNA pairing, and that only occurred when he went into Italy, and it happened after a Tour de France stage in Italy because it was the Italian Olympic Committee that were really trying to prosecute him. And then there was a further 2 years really before he was banned, and he was only banned because they found EPO in the blood. He wasn't banned because he was considered to have performed or prepared a blood transfusion. They actually found EPO in the blood. So it's a tricky operation, even when you don't start thinking about the statute of limitations, and also start thinking about the fact that according to the WADA code, samples may be frozen and retested for up to 10 years. And again, these bags have been frozen and stored now for over 10 years. So there's another...
And it was 8 years at the time, the statute of limitation. It was 8 years at the time, wasn't it?
Exactly. So I would not, if I was a fan and, you know, someone hoping that the truth is going to get out, which obviously we all hope, then I unfortunately wouldn't hold my breath. And, you know, you think about the kind of legal challenges that might arise from this, and you think about, you know, WADA's budget, and there's also always a lot of confusion about what exactly WADA does and can do as a body. You know, they're not, you know, people sometimes assume that they do all the testing, they're responsible for everything in anti-doping. They're not. But their budget, WADA's annual budget, I mean, they don't release the exact figure, but they do say in their own documentation that their annual budget is approximately $30 million, and you know, that's inferior to, for example, the Team Sky annual budget, the Team Sky cycling team, and that's for all of anti-doping across the world. And you know, you imagine the sort of legal costs that they may incur from pursuing this issue, and it starts to look slightly onerous. And, you know, when you consider the amount of debate around current anti-doping and whether certain substances are detectable, whether WADA needs to invest more in research, this and that, and you kind of start to wonder whether it's really worth their while. And also consider the fact that I think there are 7 cyclists who have not been identified. That certainly the Spanish police thought there were 7 cyclists whose blood they weren't able to tie to a particular rider. The majority of those riders presumably now have retired. And you know, where do you start? You can't simply go out into the peloton and say please give us please give us your DNA. You can't say that to 500 riders in the hope that one of them will then match the bags.
Can I just have a look at that cup you've had a drink of coffee out of? Yeah, no, it's not really going to happen. I think the rejoicing owed a lot to probably misguided hope that other sports would be drawn into it. You know, there's always been rumoured to be footballers, tennis players, but the challenges in identifying those athletes, I would imagine, would be even greater than the cyclists. So it's probably not going to happen.
And again, sorry to harp on about this, but there were 211 blood bags, or as far as we know, there were 211 blood bags in Barcelona. There was talk at the time about footballers, tennis players. That all arose from interviews, whether it was interviews that Eufemiano Fuentes himself gave, or there was a particular report in Le Monde. A Le Monde journalist went to see Fuentes in the Canaries. He allegedly showed the Le Monde journalist information which implicated football teams and tennis players. Le Monde subsequently referred to these documents they had supposedly seen, which the Spanish police had not seized, and they were sued, and they were successfully sued. So there is, and I think I'm not alone among journalists in having seen the Puerto police documents, and I can pretty much guarantee there is nothing that in those files, unless there is a secret stash of files that no one has thus far seen. There is nothing in those files.
Well, listen, let's not make this our Operation Puerto special, because we do have an Operation Puerto Friends special coming up before the end of this month on the eve of the Tour de France, because it was 10 years ago on the eve of the 2006 Tour that the whole thing broke. We were all there and caught up in it, and we're gonna be sort of reliving that drama, aren't we, in our next Friends special. So perhaps you should leave some discussion of it for that. There was another story over the weekend, wasn't there, Daniel? Motors and bikes. There
was another report, Rich, a second instalment of an investigation that Stade 2, the French television programme, are working on as regards motor doping. They did one a few weeks ago in which they talked to a Hungarian engineer, a gentleman who's becoming a notorious engineer of motors that fit into bikes, and Istvan Vargas. I think he's also being referred to as Stefano. Stefano, I think, is an Italianisation of the Hungarian Christian name Istvan. Anyway, I think it's the same guy. Anyway, there seems to have been in 2014 correspondence between the UCI technical manager Mark Barfield and a gentleman called Harry Gibbings, who also makes electric bikes, and he's based in Monaco. The French police seem to have been interested in the issue of mechanical fraud occurring in the Tour de France. They got wind of a visit from Istvan Vargas to the Tour de France. He was supposedly, allegedly, going to meet some teams there or speak to riders. We don't know whether the riders and the teams themselves were aware of this. I mean, you do get, sales reps and various people turning up to the Tour de France thinking they're going to be able to speak to riders and teams, and the riders and teams don't actually, have not made any appointments or anything. So, and yeah, there seems to be a chain of emails from the UCI technical manager Mark Barfield to Harry Gibbings and also Istvan Vargas, and it's all it all certainly merits further explanation. The UCI have pledged to investigate and presumably communicate about their findings. No action has been taken yet, but all curious, I would say, rather than shocking or disgraceful at this point, and certainly we await further developments with great interest.
It is, Daniel, and it's no doubt a story we will return to, of course.
Can I just return to something I said as well?
You may.
I mentioned the 2014 Tour de France. This gentleman, Vargas, was supposedly going to visit 2014 Tour de France. I think it was 2015. I think I made a small mistake there. Sorry.
No problem. Well, we should wrap up for this week because we've gone on long enough. So thank you very much, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
And thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, chaps.
And we'll be back next week.
You've been listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pair for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.